Well, good evening. Welcome to Madison, our Wednesday night class here in Bixler Chapel. We've got a few people in the room with us tonight, and if you're tuning in, we'd love to have you join us in-house in Bixler Chapel, the lovely Bixler Chapel. But we're thrilled to have you online with us tonight, and I missed being here last Sunday. Nathan did a great job preaching, and then I missed last Wednesday night being with Frank. John Slate taught. And John's a little bit under the weather. He's supposed to be here tonight, so I've been called off the bench. I do think it's kind of interesting that we kind of have the same uniform on, so that's why I decided to use the off-the-bench metaphor there. Now, next Wednesday night's the Thanksgiving Eve, and so there'll be no class. But the following Wednesday night is the first Wednesday night of December. And so here live in Bixler is going to be Larry Souder, and he has Jamie Hurd, and her husband Daniel will be here, and they have a story. I think you've heard her speak, Frank. Can you give us a little summary of what her story's about?
They had a tragic loss in their family, and they've handled it as beautifully as you can from a Christian perspective. Okay. But it'll be very informative, inspiring, of course sad, but meaningful.
Yeah. And I know Larry will do a good job. He always does a great job with these interviews, and given his background, I don't know that will be an easy interview to do, so we need to be praying for him and that God will just use that conversation. So now last week you and John were talking about anxiety with teens and other people, and can you kind of give me just a brief summary of some of what you covered, and then you've got a whole new area that you're going to cover tonight. So can you kind of give me a thumb? So some people may not have been here last week, so can you kind of give us a slight review?
We tried to be practical and just talking about children and teenagers and what we can do as parents and even as grandparents to help children when they're experiencing anxiety. We didn't get very far with it. I mean, I think we had some good pointers here and there along the way. So
pointers like if they're anxious, drag them in the gravel until they stop being anxious.
That was one of the points. Sorry, I remember. No, I think the main takeaway is model what you would expect them to be like.
Yeah.
That's where they're going to learn what to do when they're anxious.
And that's huge.
I think that's the hugest part.
Yeah.
It's what they see growing up, they have a tendency to repeat when they're adults.
And I wonder sometimes, I mean, one of the things I see sometimes is I think that whether there's a genetic tendency, for example, towards anger or anxiety, but it seems like there's some people kind of wired for that. But usually, if it is genetic, then they acquired that tendency from one of the parents. And once again, what that person does is now instructing that child, this is what you do when you have anxiety or anger or whatever. And so usually it's kind of a double whammy. You've got the genetic predisposition, but you also have the social environment that says, well, this is the way I handle anger. So for parents or grandparents, it seems like one of the big challenges is I've got to deal with it in myself before I can really help them deal with it. And I can actually teach them out of my experience there's a better way.
Perfectly said. I mean, let's not get into the habit of blaming children.
No.
I mean, many times they're just acting out what they've seen growing up. And it's hard to know whether it's nature or nurture. There's always controversy
Usually
about
a
that.
combination of some type.
Yeah.
Hey, before we go on, did you talk about the difference between, because one of the things I've seen with people who have anxiety, there's this kind of always anxious personality, and then there is this kind of situational anxiety. So did y'all make a distinction between that at all, or can you talk about that briefly?
I can talk about that briefly. I mean, I think people are wired differently. I mean, scientists have confirmed that. There's some that come out of the womb. I mean, they're very active. They're very attuned to everything happening in the environment and reactive. Mm-hmm. And there's some that are just easier. They're calmer. And so, yes, there are those differences from the very beginning. And thankfully, I had one that was easy. We did talk about that last week. Our son was one of the calmer ones, so I was very happy about that.
I sense that you're a fairly non-anxious person also. Is that fair?
That is fair to say.
Okay, yeah.
But I think I learned to be that way.
Oh, really? So you think early you tend to be pretty anxious?
No.
Okay.
No. Maybe it's both working in my
Both
favor
working
here. I don't
in
think
our
I've struggled with that. So,
Good. Okay.
So
So now
what?
you got new material for us.
Okay.
Take off.
So what we're going to do starting out tonight was just thinking about Jesus himself and thinking about him as a child. And do you remember that experience of his? Of course you do, when he was 12. This is in Luke 2, verses 48 through 52, when he is left in the temple and his parents don't know what's going on. And it does not seem to me that he is anxious about that.
They are.
They are. In fact, that word is used in the text, that they're anxiously searching for him, as any parent would be. But he's not anxious. And I was trying to figure out, well, why not? Why isn't a 12-year-old child anxious? He must already have confidence in God's care for him. He said, I had to be in my father's house about my father's business. Had he heard the faith stories from Mary and Joseph about his birth? Did he know who he was? God's son. We don't know that definitively one way or the other. We know that there was the escape into Egypt when he was little, and this is in Matthew 2. In verse 19, it tells about Joseph being told by an angel to take his family to Egypt to escape harm. So there's a divine intervention there. Did he know about that? Jesus, that is. Okay, an angel has intervened before to help us. In verse 22, when they come back, Joseph is warned in a dream about going back to Judea. Had Jesus been told about that? The point is, in our families, we have stories to tell about how God has taken care of us. And we want to pass that on to the next generation so they can build their life around that. So I was going to ask John, but now I'm going to ask you, do you have a story to tell, have you told your children, about how God has worked in your life to take care of you? It gives them a foundation to draw upon. They say, I know it's true. This has happened in my family. I think I've got one, but putting you on the spot here, do you have one?
Well, at least you gave me a little warning.
I did beforehand, so I could be asking you
this would have been the story I would have thought of. So when I was working at Otter Creek Church for 5 years, at that time I had 3 children. One that he was born in 85, so he had been 5 years old when they let me go. That's a nice way of saying I got fired. And there had been, even before that event had happened, I think there'd been not a lot, but there'd been some anxiety for me just because the situation was very unstable, and I felt like that I couldn't find a way to solve a problem that was relational with the elders. And but what was interesting was, so when they let me go, I think they gave me a month's salary, and that was it. And so and so you would think that would be the time where you were really anxious, but for me, it was a time of great relief. I had been praying about the situation at Otter Creek. I'd been really taking very seriously in my life for 2 or 3 years at that point, and trying to learn to trust Jesus, that you had this personal relationship with him. That was one of the things that made people at that church uncomfortable at that time, that you could actually interact with Jesus, hear from him, that he would take care of you. And there were 2 or 3 things that happened the week before I gave the sermon that led to their showing up on Monday morning with my doors, locks changed and all that. But there were 2 or 3 things that happened during that week where I just wasn't sure if that was a sermon I was supposed to do, but there were 2 or 3 kind of coordinated things that seemed to me to be very clear experiences from God, that if I didn't do what I planned to do, I'd be disobedient, and that I needed to obey him, and if I would, he would take care of me. And one of the big ones was there was a minister at that time, Jim Olive, who, when I talked to him early in the week about what I thought God was telling me to do, because I feel like sometimes you need to confirm things with somebody, he had said, I don't think that's going to be a good thing to do. I said, well, okay, would you just be praying about that this week? And he said he would. And we both have been going through this kind of phase in our lives where the Spirit of God seemed to be very active. Interesting things were happening. It was a very intense period. So, but he kind of cast doubt on that, and I was going, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not really hearing from God. But then on Friday, I think it was, he called me and goes, I've been praying about this. And he said, I feel like that God has made it clear to me that you are supposed to do what you've been shown to do. God was very specific in that with you. And I feel like, he said, I think that if you don't do it, there'll be more problems than if you do it. And so it led to consequences. I mean, usually what you have the sense of is if you trust God, the consequences will be really nice. Mm-hmm. And so you don't think about being fired as being really nice. But what I was convinced of was, number one, the relationship between me and those elders was not healthy. They'd had a hard time having a healthy relationship with anybody in that role. They'd had a history, and even the next minister they hired, they ended up firing him, letting him go. He took a whole group and started a group. But one of the nice things was a few weeks afterwards, there were a number of members who met with me. Some talked about starting another church. I made it clear I wouldn't do that. So we committed ourselves to pray about that. And that's where Encouragement Ministries was born in 1990, which would be 30 years. And so out of that kind of adversity, where there was that sense of calm that God knows what he's doing, it may seem crazy to outsiders, but that when you're in the center of this, God can take care of you. And so that was one of the really great experiences. And then over the 30 years with Encouragement Ministries, one of the things that I made a commitment to was I was not going to spend much time raising money. I didn't feel like that was my role. I felt like if God was giving you a work to do, he would move hearts and provide for the work he's given you to do. And so we've been about as low-key as any nonprofit ever on raising money. But year after year after year, God has provided, opened doors, created possibilities. And there's sometimes I feel a little hint of the anxiety where if it's not been a very good year for giving, the end of the year is coming. But what I continue to do, Frank, is I continue to remind myself, God has provided. If this is the thing he wants to continue, then he'll continue to provide. And if he's done with this, that's his choice. And so if he's done, then praise him for giving us, for example, this would be 30 years. So I think that's kind of that to me is one of my anchor things in believing that God can provide in ways that most churches, when they model doing church, they don't take that into account. They've got all this other stuff you got to do, but they don't have that sense of God is personal, he's involved, and you seek him first before anything else. And so I think and I've talked to my children about that, and I've talked to some other people. Sometimes people look at me like, well, that sounds crazy to me, but that doesn't matter, because when you have had that experience, it's a little bit like in John 9, where the guy gets healed, he's blind, he's healed, and the Pharisees are on him, putting pressure on him and all that kind of stuff. But he's not afraid. He stands up and he goes, well, why are you asking all these questions about the man who healed me? Is that because you want to follow him too? And they really get mad.
I think there's a little sarcasm in that.
Yeah. So
yeah. Well,
that would be my story.
Well, that's a great story. Good came out of bad.
It did. And
Encouragement Ministries came out of this, and that you passed this along. I mean, your children know the story, and
but the key is God can help us. And I think we have lost a lot of confidence in that. With prayer, I think that's why a lot of people struggle with prayer, because they're not really believing that God can help them. And when I read the Psalms, and like Psalm 46, where he talks about God's my refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble, therefore I will not fear, though the earth move and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. And then he talks about situations of war. And he's going, but I trust God because God is in control of this.
Well, I think we can apply that to where we are with the pandemic right now is
Amen.
I saw a church sign as I was driving down Gallatin Road today, pray for a cure for the pandemic. And I was thinking, yes, we need to be bold in praying for a cure, and good can come out of bad somehow. We can see God still with us, even though so many bad things are happening to people all over the world. Well, I've got a faith story.
Well, good. I want to hear your story, Frank. What's yours?
Okay. 16 years old, I got my first job working downtown at the Insurance Company of North America. Doesn't exist anymore. And I got it through the Madison High School vice principal, who was James Bridgman, who was a member here at Madison, an elder here at Madison. And he called our home and wanted to know, because INA, that's what they were called, INA, had called and wanted to see if there could be a high school guy to work after school in the file department. So he called my mother for my brother and me to go down there and interview. And so we didn't know any better. We dressed up in suits to go down to interview for a file department job. Looked mighty good. Had a handkerchief in my pocket, by the way. See, that's where that comes from.
Right.
Okay, and so I got the job, but they didn't hire John because you couldn't have two family members working at the same time. And I could drive. I just turned 16. He hadn't gotten his license yet because we couldn't pay insurance for two teenage drivers. I don't think.
Picked?
Yeah, and I got picked. And out of that,
How did she pick that? Did y'all flip a coin?
I don't remember.
Okay.
But somehow I was the one that drove and I had the insurance. But out of having that job at INA, you won't believe this. You know what I got out of that?
I think I do.
Okay, I may have told you personally. I found Diane there.
Yeah.
That's where she was working. So I finally got the courage when I was in college to ask her out.
I mean, you're hired in high school.
And I saw her even then.
So you had a little anxiety about being rejected, so you didn't ask for a long time.
Well, that's true.
Okay.
That is true. It took maybe 4 or 5 years. But finally, I wrote her a card and asked her if she would go out with me. And I had to wait a couple of weeks. And finally, I got something in the mail from her, a letter saying I could call her, and I did. But so I found Diane at INA, and then I got this college scholarship that paid for all of my college through INA.
Wow.
And this was directly God's providence from His hand. And I've used that story, telling my son and others just, I didn't even know to worry. I wasn't anxious, and I didn't know how, like, for example, my brother and I would end up going to Lipscomb together and paying for it. I didn't even know enough to worry. I was that dumb, I guess, that naive. You have to pay for college, huh? Okay. But through that, I've got my college education, and I found Diane. But that was directly through God's hand.
That's great.
So there's a faith story.
But see, I find something interesting in the story that's not the main point.
Yeah.
But I experienced that too. So the experience of asking a girl out would create great anxiety for me. And the reason is I had 3 sisters. And so I watched them when a guy would call and ask out. And because we're in the South, sometimes they would say yes when they didn't want to. And so you get this horrible, messed up look on the face, and they're upset. And as soon as they hang up the phone. And so I was kind of traumatized by my sisters accepting dates with somebody they didn't want. And so it was that sense of fear of being rejected. And so I was, back then, the nice thing was you didn't call her ID back then. It was rotary phones. So you could dial, you could almost do it, and I would hang up. And then sometimes it would actually ring, and there were probably a couple of times I hung up, but just trying to work up the courage, because one of the ways of trying to deal with anxiety is finding the courage to move past the feeling in order to do the thing that needs to be done. And once you do the thing, a lot of times the anxiety goes away, because what you realize is it's not nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Okay, and that's going to be one of the main points. You're anticipating this. Very good, Rusty.
Little did I know.
Point for you. We have to face our fears and do something about it. If we give in to the fear, it just continues to grow and exist right there. You have to do something to face it and take a small step in action. And that's what we have to encourage our young people to do. Don't give in to the fear.
Yeah.
You've got to fight back.
Is there, I mean, before we go on, because I know you got stuff, so do you make a distinction between anxiety and worry?
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, they're pretty close. Throw stress into the pot, too. I mean, all of it is pretty similar there.
So what is the difference between, I mean, I have an idea, as I explained to some people, but I'd be curious to you, the difference between, so you have, when anxiety gets really bad, you call it anxiety attack. Mm-hmm. Then you also have panic attacks. So what's the distinction between an anxiety attack and a panic attack?
There is no difference.
None.
No, it's just the same, different words for the same experience.
That's interesting, because I always took panic attack as being more extreme in the sense of it now has tipped over. It's not just I'm just anxious and I can't get rid of it. It is now I can't get my breath. But you're saying that's false.
Well, I mean, people use the same words, basically, same phenomenon. I mean, I've never had one.
Me either.
But I've heard this from many people, it really feels like you cannot breathe and you're going to die. Unless you've been through it before and you know, I'm not going to die, I can exist through this, and they do. And there's some comfort in that.
Yeah.
But that is extreme. Okay, so what I'm trying to say about Jesus here is I think there must have been faith stories that he knew, so he had the confidence, even at 12 years old, to handle that so well. And we have in Luke 2, verse 40, and the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. So he's growing in the right way. It would be interesting to know what his teenage years were like. But they're called the hidden years because we don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think we would have said a perfect child. I mean, not perfect. Sinless. I mean, I think there's a difference between sinless and perfect. I mean, I think, okay, he was a teenager.
Yeah.
He's learning. He's learning and growing.
Yeah, one of the things when I've looked at that story, one of the things I think about is already there was training in his life because he's conversing with them in a way that's fairly sophisticated. They're impressed. The teachers are.
Yes.
So it must indicate, number one, that he'd had growing up training. So part of that could be because of what his parents knew about who he was and that responsibility. But he'd been trained early to be able to talk about the Bible and to be able to think about things so that when he was at the temple, what he saw going on there and apparently conversations he heard, he wanted to be a part of it. It was not that he was afraid of that conversation. Instead, there's something alluring about the conversation, which kind of reminds you of, you have a child at a ballpark or something that gets away from you, and they don't realize that they should be anxious because they're so enamored with what's going on, the event. Now, when they finally realize, they look around, they can't find you, then the anxiety may kick in.
Right.
But a lot of times before that happens, as a parent, you realize you've lost your child. That creates anxiety, doesn't it?
That would be anxiety-provoking, yes. Well, that's a great point. I mean, Jesus was engaged with God early. And so he wasn't anxious because this was something he was enthused about, that type of discussion. Yeah. Well, let me move on to his baptism. And this was a new thought for me, and I think I hadn't read this. I think I just came up with this for a point for me. I gave you a point. I'm giving me a point. All right. Jesus' baptism in Matthew 3, verse 17. It's also in Mark chapter 1. I mean, you remember the story when he's baptized by John, and you remember the voice of God speaking after the baptism. Here's Matthew 3:17. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." This is happening before he begins his ministry. This isn't God basing it upon any of his accomplishments. This predates anything that he was doing in his ministry. God is looking at his heart and saying, I approve of you, I'm blessing you, I'm pleased with you. And it's getting to this idea of a parent's unconditional love builds that foundation for a child's life, not based upon what they are doing. They don't have to be the best, the first, the greatest. They can just be themselves.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's
Now, don't
there.
say but.
I think
You're
a
going to
lot-
say a but.
I think a lot of that is there. I think also what you may find with Jesus is, I think he heard the stories about the angels appearing. I think he knew something about who he was. And I think his parents have taken responsibility for training him. And so once again, when he shows up at 11, Dallas Willard talks about the idea that Jesus probably grew up as an apprentice to his father, learning the trade of being a carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
So he's viewed as a carpenter's son. And so, like a lot of the things that you look at in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the things I think about is that he was learning as a carpenter dealing with customers who could be obnoxious and difficult and demanding. But he was learning. So I think a lot of what he's teaching people in the Sermon on the Mount are lessons that he's learned from the practical experience of being exposed to people, but knowing who he is. It kind of goes back to what Nathan was talking about on Sunday, where he talks about we all are in the image of God. We have inherently dignity and worth and value. Now, our parents may not have reinforced that. Our peers may not have reinforced that. They may call us names, all that kind of stuff. But I think Jesus has that sense of he knows who he is. And so there is this confidence that comes with that. But he's obviously brilliant.
Yeah.
When you look at what he's able to do, the way he's able to handle people with logic and all that, he's not just even that story at 11 years old, the experts are surprised at his brilliance. He is able to interact with them in a way where they're going, whoa.
And that came from his training, that came from whatever inherent intelligence he had. The point I'm wanting to dig in on is how important it is for us parents to love our children unconditionally, without any buts. But you've got to do this. But you've got to improve this. I know we want the best for our children. All of us do. But they have to feel loved, cherished, all of that for them to be their best. Yeah. Where they can feel I can be me and be loved. Even though I may be different than others, it is okay with God and it is okay with my mother and father. Mm-hmm. Jesus must have had that. He knew what his mission was. Somehow his parents had inculcated that within him. He knew. This teaching of loving God and loving people, that's what we want for our children. If we had a family crest or a motto, that would be it. And it comes back to, out of anything in our children, we want them to have a good heart. That's what God looks at. It's not how well can you play the piano, how good a first baseman are you. What is your heart? And here's the encouraging thing about children. All children can have a good heart. You don't have to be talented.
That's true. It's pretty easy to hurt a heart, though. I think.
Now, hearts can be wounded. Now, you're going to say that, aren't you?
Yeah,
early on.
Yeah, early on, especially nowadays. I don't know that I'd want to be a teenager now. You look at social media and the things that come into your life through that phone that is carried around or the computer, all that stuff.
I had a teenager look at me, it was several weeks ago, and said, "My phone is my life."
They might have been able to say, "My phone is my God." Because when that's really, when we talk about our relationship with God, that's what our life is. We're in love with God, that's our life. And so when we're more dependent on the phone than God, then what that may mean is that.
Well, and we adults have to look at ourselves too in that regard.
We have gods also. I agree. I'm with you 100% on that. Yes, I certainly have.
All right. Let me keep going with Jesus' life here.
Okay.
All right. The story of Gethsemane before the crucifixion, recorded several places. In Luke 22, it's recorded. and before the arrest, we know the story. And I really do think there's such a thing as natural anxiety because Jesus felt anxious. He wanted God's will to be done, but he knew that he was going to be facing torture and death. And when you read the story, he's sweating and probably his heart is beating fast and the adrenaline is pumping, but he handles it so beautifully. But I want to say first, if there was a threat outside the door right now, every one of us in this room would get anxious if we thought there was someone out there ready to do us harm. That's going to be natural, a natural reaction. We're not going to stay totally calm. We're not built like that. Fight, flight, or freeze. Those are human responses. So Jesus' response was, I don't want to go through this, but I want God's will, even beyond that. So what does he do? How does he deal with his anxiety? And we know the answer to that. It's prayer. Sustained prayer, not a group prayer. He's wanting his disciples to pray for him.
They keep falling asleep.
They mess up over and over. So he's not depending upon them. And he goes off, and we don't know how long the prayers took, but it just reminds me of peace comes in our life when we have isolated prayer with God, me and God, you and God, over a period of time. I think that is the number one go-to for our anxious times. Well, I know it is. I don't need to say I think. I know it is because Jesus is modeling this to us. In Philippians 4:7, we are promised peace that passes all understanding, like a supernatural peace. And Jesus was able to have that. How did he face all that he faced unless he had experienced the prayer and that relationship with the Lord that was strengthened?
Well, what's also interesting is, so when you look in the Gospel of Luke around chapter 9 is where things shift, and he's now heading to Jerusalem. And all the way there, he's talking about he's going there to die. Now, his disciples are anxious about that. He doesn't seem to be, he knows death is coming. Even, especially like in the Gospel of John, you have chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, and that great prayer in 17, where he had this Jesus talking dialogue. There's nothing in that dialogue that creates that sense of, so he knows Gethsemane's coming. He goes there. Instead of running away,
there's no panic.
He goes there. There's
Yes.
no panic. There's no anxiety. He is speaking peace to them. Peace I give you. He's interceding for them, praying for them, even for us, that we would know this relationship with the Father that he's known. And you see him acting with this sense of great calm. And of course, he does get in the garden, and then there's this prayer. But I think part of what's going on with that is it is his preparing himself for the reality of what he's known is coming. So it's the hour is right there, but as soon as that time of prayer is over, the mob shows up, and he still seems to be in control in that moment. Peter's pulling the sword out, chopping off an ear. Jesus heals the ear. He even says, I've been with you all the time. Why do you come to me at night? And so there is but I don't think there's any shortcut to that kind of confidence in God. I think Jesus is saying, and you can see it in Peter and John in the book of Acts, where they don't have it now. Their anxiety leads them to run away. Peter's anxiety leads him to deny Jesus. But you get into the book of Acts, and Peter and John's courage, they're standing up against those people who had Jesus crucified, and they have this confidence that is once again throwing everybody off stride, because they know that the response is supposed to be a flight or freezing and whatever, and yet they're modeling what they've seen in Jesus, and that is a confidence that God, whether they die. Stephen's another good example. No matter what happens to me, even death, God has me. That's There's no shortcut to getting confidence
Well,
like that.
that's a point. That's a lifetime in developing.
It is. And I think also a work of the Spirit. Yeah. But go ahead. You got
No,
other
no,
stuff?
I'm just reflecting on what you just said. A work of the Spirit, and it takes a long time to develop that. Me and God develop that.
So when you look at the fruit of the Spirit, the first three that I mentioned are love, joy, and peace. And then it's patience. Because a lot of times my anxiety is because I'm not a very patient person. The situations I have control, I want under control, and I want under control now. So even my prayers kind of, God, you got to fix this now, instead of going, I entrust this to you.
So
Your will be done.
It comes down to, do I trust God, and will I let Him be in control?
Yes, it does.
Even us
It's easy to say.
Christians, yes,
Yeah.
battle this. Like we might say, yes, I know God is there. But, now I'm saying but.
Well, buts are helpful. We all have one.
Very good. Yes, we do. We still have trouble surrendering that. I know
We
that
do.
God will take care of me. I want to be in charge, not God. I don't quite trust Him well enough. I want to figure it out.
And I think we learn it incrementally. So if I have a tendency towards anxiety, what I have to learn to begin to do as a spiritual discipline is deal with my anxiety in very small places first. Because if the big situation comes up, I'm not going to be able to handle it unless I've been intentionally, when it's small anxiety, practicing. If I practice there, I begin to gain some confidence. And I can put myself in a situation a little bit bigger. But part of that is reminding myself who God is and what can be done with all this. And even recognizing that when I pray, I can, Jesus asked in the garden, if possible, remove this cup from me. But at the same time, he goes, not my will, but yours be done. And I think a lot of us, when you hear people talk about praying and all that, so a lot of times the story that gets told are the stories that work out well. I think we also need to hear stories about where things didn't work out well, but we continue to trust God. So like Job says, even though he slay me, I will trust him. Not many of us are there spiritually. And I don't think there's any shortcut to that. I think that's why discipleship is an apprenticeship with Jesus. Learning how to do what he taught to do means my heart has got to become more like his heart. The way my mind works has got to become more like his. I've got to deal with my emotions. I've even got to learn how to deal with my body. So in anxiety, there are a lot of things that are kind of bodily responses. And learning how to cope with that body wiring. So for some people, it seems that not only anxiety but depression, sometimes there is, it seems to me to be not only certain practices or disciplines or counseling, but sometimes it may even need to be some form of medication. I don't mean getting overly medicated.
That's true.
But
Because
there may be some things to kind of take the edge off so that I can begin to learn to cope.
yes, I mean, I'm not against anti-anxiety medications or anti-depression medication. Yes, sometimes we're needed.
We do.
They're needed because it helps the body with this. Yeah. So you're talking about practical things, and let me throw out another one. Like you're saying, okay, tackle small anxieties first.
Yes.
Okay, here's another one. What I tell people to do, if you have an anxious thought, picture a river and put the thought on a log that you just see floating down the river. And don't give it as much power, that thought, as what we typically do. The thought is not real. It's not tangible. It's just a construct. Watch it float down the river and wave goodbye to it. Now, it's not always that simple, but it's something that we practice where the anxiety is not going to define me.
And it goes back like you've already mentioned the Philippians 4 passage where Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice. And he talks about don't be anxious about anything, but in prayer with petition and thanksgiving, make your request known to God. And the God of peace will be with you. But then he goes on, that next section, he invites us to be aware of what are we thinking about? Where are we placing our mind? And so Paul is encouraging his readers to learn how to discipline where their thoughts go. And what he says after that is really instructive. He goes, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice.
You know, that's a good definition of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is another one. See, you're helping out right now. See?
Good. Off the bench.
Very good. Yeah. You have to battle your thoughts.
You do.
Battle your anxious thoughts and replace them with, well, God will be with me, with the thoughts that are more legitimate, putting God in your thoughts. And the behavioral part is, well, do something. If we just stay stuck in the anxiety, do something constructive. And it can be just a small step of something that can move you past that.
Yeah, I remember in college, I had a roommate who was becoming increasingly anxious about a paper that was due. And so finally I said, look, start writing. Stop putting it off. Start to put some things down. You've got a few days before it's due. And it kind of amazed him because what he found was once he got started and was just content with getting a sentence that would become a paragraph, and then he could stop and the next day build on. But he talked about how he had never had anybody help him actually. It was always kind of put off, and then at the last minute, I got to get it done, and then it's all that sense of panic is up there. And
That's how I did my papers.
No,
I'd wait to the last minute, and then I would hate myself because it wouldn't be my best effort there. If I knew this at the time, of just start. But many times, what we're doing, we're waiting for the feeling to change. You know, oh, I want to be motivated. Well, no, you do it anyway, and hopefully do the action, and the feeling will catch up later.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. Doing something constructive, like write a sentence.
Write a sentence.
Yeah.
The blank page just stares at you.
Yeah.
So get something down, even if you get rid of it later. And sometimes I've gotten rid of large chunks of sermons, of paper, all that kind of stuff where I've just had to be a vicious editor. But the getting started was the key part.
Yes, taking some action. Here's another thing, and I look upon, I know we only have a minute or two or three now, but here's the big one for me. It just comes back to what is our worldview? If that is faulty, everything else is going to be faulty. And if my worldview is there is a God, He loves me, He will take care of me, He will help me, that changes everything.
It does, especially if those are not simply kind of slogans, kind of doctrines that are parked somewhere in the back of our brain, the religious section that's walled off from everything else. So when I say, God is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? God's the stronghold of my life, of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked advance against me to devour me, it's my enemies and my foes who will stumble and fall. He meant those words. I think people memorize those words, but they've not begun the work of how do I get from having the words on a plaque or having the words memorized to those words being a truth about who I am with God. That's where, when we don't take discipleship seriously, we don't know how to get there from here. And I think the path of getting there from here is we've got to be disciples of Jesus. And He says, so you're weary and burdened of this anxiety? Come to me. I'll give you rest, but you're going to have to get in the yoke, and you have to learn from me. For I'm gentle and humble in heart. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. And I think he wants to be teaching us how to do these things. And for some, the lesson's going to be tougher than for others. So if you're wired to not be a terribly anxious person, it might not be so tough. But even for those who are not kind of the anxious anxiety, it still has ways of showing up in us. It still kind of becomes a thing where it's tapping us on the shoulder, even if we don't know to call it anxiety. It's that thing there that's, but once you become aware, you kind of go, oh, this is an opportunity to work with Jesus. He can teach me. I can take this to him. We can work on this. And if I do well, this little piece, maybe 6 months, a year from now, I'll be able to handle something much bigger. Having hope that's possible.
And we parents, as we close here, I mean, we parents, us grandparents,
Encourage.
we have a big part to play in
We
this.
do, and encourage your children. Yep. All right. Well, our time is up. Those of you who joined us tonight, thank you for being with us in-house. Appreciate that. Those who are online, thanks for being online. I appreciate our technical team back there taking care of the sound and visually and all that. Remember, Larry Souder in 2 weeks from tonight. Next week, no classes because night before Thanksgiving. But Larry will be doing stories of Amazing Grace, and you're welcome to have a live audience here. The ones who watch it online that night will be watching the video from a month ago, and you'll be able to see that for the first time live and on screen. So we love you. We're grateful to have you. Sunday is Thanks Singing Sunday, so we'll be singing together and sharing Lord's Supper and all that. It's also Thanksgiving Love Offering Day, and so I hope you'll be making plans to be generous that day. That's always a special morning for Madison as we have some important things we want to do, and so we hope that you'll make plans to be a generous giver then. But it's good to have you with us. And you may have some of your own anxieties, and my friend Frank is a really skillful therapist.
Now quit that, Russ. You got to stop that.
And I refer on to him often. But if I can be of help, let me know. And my guess is when John Slate gets to feeling better, he might also be a valuable resource. But to me, that's one of the things that's being willing to say, I had this problem, I need help. That is the beginning of finding a solution. And without that, it's called denial and not taking responsibility for it. So sometimes just being willing to speak about it is important. Well, Frank, would you close us with prayer?
Sure. Father, we're thankful that you are there in our life. We've experienced you personally, and we know that you help us, and you're our source in difficult times. You're our source of strength. Please be with all of those who are here tonight, those listening and watching tonight. Bless us all as we try to serve you. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks again for being with us. John Slate, if you're tuned in, we hope you're feeling better soon. And thank you for letting me sit in for you tonight.
You're a good sub.
A good sub, all right. God bless you guys getting home. Be safe.